I can remember um, when Michael Hollis came to me. I never forget this. I was in Washington D.C. I had just left Andy Young as his district director for his congressional office when Carter appointed him in '76 to be the UN ambassador. So I told Andy, I said, look, my man, I think what we need to do, I'm going to go to the Export Import Bank in Washington because I think at that time I was completed some additional graduate work at Georgia State in business. And I felt at that time I wanted to transition over to the Exim Bank and really understand global economies, the economies in Africa, the economies in the Caribbean, South America, and Asia. So I went in, got appointed by Carter to the Exim Bank, eventually started managing all of their co-financing projects with AID and with the World Bank in those markets, those underserved markets. And I remember at that time Michael Hollis had left the 3 Mile Island Commission, where he was Deputy General Counsel. He had been appointed by Jimmy Carter. He and President Carter were very close. And Michael walks in my office at Exim Bank after he had left Oppenheimer investment banking firm, where he had gone for 2 years after the 3 Mile Island Commission had expired, and said, he walked in, closed the door, and said, let me talk to you, Julius. I said, what's up, my man? He said, I want to start a commercial airline. So I looked at him. I said, wait a minute, I know my brother. He is smart. He's gutsy. I looked at him for about 2 minutes, and then I pulled out. In those days, you didn't have a whiteboard, so I pulled out my pad. I said, all right, let's tell me how you gonna do this.
So it was that quick?
That 2 minutes. So for the next 2 hours, we went through A, through B, through C, through D. 2 hours turned into 4 hours. 4 hours turned into 6 hours. And by the 6th hour, I said, okay. I mean, in the 3rd hour, actually, I said, okay, we got it. Because in my head, I knew it could be done. The question was, how do you can raise the money. How do you raise the money for a commercial airline, which had never been done by a black entrepreneur? But I knew, and he made a good point, we had Maynard Jackson. We had the political clout in terms of here in Atlanta to do an airline. And then we had another secret weapon. My roommate in Washington at the time, I was living in Washington, was George Dowley, who was the first black person appointed by Carter on the Civil Aeronautics Board, which regulated airlines. So all the pieces just fell in place. So that was a great moment. That was a watershed moment for the both of us when we realized that we can put this together,
So let's go back a little bit. So you just probably, listeners have probably got 1,000 questions after you just unpacked that story right there. So first, you mentioned on several occasions the role that politics played in this, with Jimmy Carter primarily, who's just become president from the state of Georgia, that you all helped get elected, right?
Absolutely.
And without him being in the White House, does this opportunity exist?
No, without him being in the White House, it would not have existed, because just like when Maynard Jackson was elected in '73 as mayor, and Maynard demanded a change of modus operandi in the city government where contracts had to have diversity spins into them. That changed the whole paradigm of minority businesses in the United States. That tradition was taken to the White House when Jimmy Carter became president because the black leadership at that time in Atlanta and in Detroit under Coleman Young and knew what it meant to leverage political power for the economic empowerment of their minority businesses. Okay, so even though federal procurement policy was different, there were when Jimmy Carter was president, elect and president, more black people were in the various agencies of the federal U.S. federal government than any time in history. Mm. And we brought those experiences, respectively, in our own individual silos, to what we had learned in Atlanta, what we had learned in Detroit, Los Angeles. But everything started in Atlanta under Maynard Jackson for economic empowerment. Right. So Carter had really no choice but to be a proponent of minority economic empowerment. If you go back and look at history, it was during 1977-78 when a young black man who had served with Walter Funtroy as his chief of staff decided after Jimmy Carter was elected, and he had and all the black appointees were throughout the federal agency, that he was going to make a gutsy move and start a black television network. BET was born during that time. Mm-hmm. So you can look at the fact that in those, we use political leverage throughout the bowels of the federal government, starting here in Atlanta on a municipal level, and then it migrated to the federal government, and it was because of the great giants like Maynard, okay? The great and his supporting crew of Marvin Arrington on the city council, Morris Findlay, Rob Pitts. All of those guys were advocates that made things happen for black businesses, which went from Atlanta, Detroit, Los Angeles, New York, into the federal government.